this is Matter in Society, a response to Orensanz by Graham Harman. And, we don't ever read the abstract. We just jump in. Feel free to ask me questions along the way. I will do my best to answer them. And then at the end, there's a rating system, and y'all get to rate the paper. He's more in architecture than computer science. Interesting. Yeah. So again, it's how we are viewing the world, and the arts kind of like Graham Harman. So architecture people like him because it's not, it's like, how do we organize society as a technology, I think sometimes. And people who make buildings care about that sort of stuff. Like, buildings as ways we organize our lives, and buildings in cities as the ways we organize like society, like, just city planning. These are interesting questions sociologically and philosophically. What is it to live together? I mean, these are questions you're going to get in architecture and city planning that are important for philosophy. So it's just, you might not realize that an architecture school needs a philosopher, but they do. So this is what happens. Okay, here we go. Speaking as an object-oriented ontologist, it is a pleasure to respond to Martin Orensanz's article, Object-Oriented Ontology and Materialism. So it's from 2024, so it's a pretty contemporary stuff. Among other things, it is refreshing that the first lines of his abstract get straight to the point. Quote, according to object-oriented ontology, matter does not exist. Here I will challenge that idea by advancing some arguments that matter can be conceptualized both as a sensual object as well as a real object. End quote. Orensanz is correct that for object-oriented ontology, matter does not exist. He correctly notes that this was true as early as my first book. Yeah, see, Harman has been on this grind for more than 2 decades at this point. He will attempt to counter this view, proclaiming that matter can be treated on Wu's own terms as both a real object and a sensual object. Perhaps I should begin by saying that the sort of matter attacked by Wu was initially the formless prime matter, thought by some to exist prior to any individual objects, but to an increasing degree the target has been the pre-individual realm championed by Gilbert Simondon. Okay, and so he's coming out of a Heideggerian tradition, and that's the Dasein, the being, the whatever the ultimate reality is that, Heidegger was being like, let's go back to being. What is this being? And so Graham Harman was like, as far as I understand, he was like, no. We've got objects in the world. We have to get rid of this uber concept of being and just live in our object world. You liked his work with Cardinal speakers? Yeah, they're good, high quality stuff. Aesthetic lens rather than tech. Yep. So yeah. So that's what this prime matter stuff might be. I'm not entirely sure, but it is what I think it is. So when he says, like, it used to be talking about like this, whatever the big kind of like being of the universe is, they were like, let's get rid of that. But now there's some pre-individual realm. I don't know what that is. I think actually that might be the state of the universe before humans conceived of it. So, like, of course, there was a time before humans, but how do we conceive of how the universe actually existed without our sort of like sociological time, contextualized time and space? So it's before the individual recognizes the world. How is the world if you try to decontextualize anything human from that? It's primary material from alchemy. Oh, interesting. Okay, I don't know what that alchemy is, but I guess there's like some basic material of just like, is it kind of like mana can be like preformed into anything you want it to be? That's kind of cool. Okay, if something exists, then it is one, and in that case, its unity gives it a minimum of one quality. In Wu's terms, this is enough to make it an object, even if it is given such an anti-objectual nickname as pre-individual, apeiron, blob, ly. One sec, excuse me. It's about time that was going to happen. So, even if it is given such an anti-objectual nicknames as pre-individual, apeiron, blob, ly, whatever, or inconsistent multiple. Yet the question of whether matter can be an object is less central for Orensanz than the rather different one of whether it can exist as both real and sensual. Thus, an explanation of these terms is in order, given that some readers of this article may not have previous familiarity with ooh. Okay, so sensual and real. We begin with the term sensual, which does not refer to the senses as opposed to the intellect, but to whatever is directly accessible as opposed to a reality that is not thus accessible. Yeah, so I think this is the Kantian stuff. You have the phenomena that you can sense, and then there's the things in themselves which we do not have access to. It would not be wholly inaccurate to link ooh's distinction between real and sensual with the Kant's division between thing in itself and appearance. Hey, look, I got something right. So, yeah. The chief difference is that for Kant, appearance always means appearance to some invariably human mind, while for ooh, the sensual realm pertains to all relations whatsoever, including those involved in inanimate causation. While this is an especially controversial and interesting aspect of ooh, it is not of particular importance to Orensanz at this juncture, and thus we can leave it aside. More pertinent here is the link between ooh's sensual realm and the concerns of phenomenology. Franz Brentano is widely credited with reviving the medieval term intentionality to refer to the property of every mental act that it is directed toward an object. Brentano also uses the phrase immanent objectivity to refer to this situation, though without clarifying what relation, if any, this immanent object might have to a world outside the mind. One of Brentano's most talented disciples, the Polish thinker Kazimierz Twardowski, proposed a dualism of objects outside the mind and qualities inside the mind. In opposition to this model, the young Edmund Husserl protested that any inside-outside distinction would render knowledge impossible, since there would be no way to establish a link between a real Berlin object in the world and the Berlin qualities I have in my mind. Rather than trying to explore how such mediation might occur, Husserl insisted that any notion of a real Berlin, different in kind from a mental Berlin qualities, is absurd. In this way, both the power and the limits of phenomenology were permanently established. On the one hand, phenomenology's rejection of anything like a Kantian thing in itself was etched in stone. On the other, Twardowski's object-content distinction was ingeniously retained by imploding both terms into the intentional sphere. This can be seen in Husserl's crucial distinction between intentional objects and the numerous fleeting adumbrations through which they become accessible to us. Yeah, so for Husserl, you have a sense experience, but then you get some sort of logical packet that gives you the properties of the objects from the world. You get this noema, this thing. So you get these intentional objects into your psychology, and so whatever goes through your head, like phantasms or these adumbrations, whatever it is, your experience, but then you get some logical objects, the properties out in the world, and that's how you understand things, because you get those properties through whatever your senses take in. Okay, unlike Husserl, object-oriented ontology regards a Kantian thing in itself not as absurd, but as an essential consequence of the fact that no relation or sum total of relations can ever exhaust the reality to which it relates. Kadir says, so he's basically saying that there is the physical object and then the object as it exists in your mind and the idea of it. Yeah. So, there's something in the world, and then you have the appearances and the intentional stuffs. So your perspective on the world, and this is a little phenomenology. So your perspective on the world, clearly we get stuff wrong every so often. So you might think, there's a point from Descartes. You might think there's a round tower off in the distance. You get a little closer, you see it's a square tower. So in your mind, you had a round tower, then you get closer, you see it's a square tower. So there's different impressions and intentions, the way you are oriented to the world. Be like, oh, we're going to see that round tower. Well, there was no round tower, there was a square tower. But this is the sort of where you get in, this sort of skeptical understanding that the world is not as we see it, but we are still oriented to things in the world, regardless of our senses not being veridical. So yeah, the square tower goes in the round hole. Yes, exactly. And so so we're quite often forcing the square towers through round holes because that's how philosophy is. We're trying to make everything fit. Yeah, and so that's it. Like, so you have an idea of Berlin, but that is not actually Berlin. But if you keep that separate, all we ever will have are our ideas of Berlin. But that can't be right because, there is something out there that is Berlin. So that's why Husserl's rejecting this thing. Now, the object-oriented person is doing something slightly different. The Berlin that is accessible to me is in fact not equivalent to the real Berlin, as easily seen from the fact that whatever Weimar era cabaret shows and Nazi rallies might occur in someone's mind, these mental experiences do not have the same causal status as the actual shows and rallies in Berlin itself. There is the additional fact that someone might be confused or outright deluded in their thoughts about Berlin, and while thoughts may be utterly confused or deluded at times, a real thing such as Berlin cannot be deluded in its act of existing, but simply is what it is. Although Martin Heidegger often shares his teacher Husserl's intuition that the inner-outer distinction is a pseudo-problem, in practice Heidegger is closer to Kant. This is perfectly clear from an explicit but under-recognized passage in his book on his great predecessor, in which he faults German idealism for its denial of the thing in itself. More broadly speaking, none of Heidegger's reflections on the forgetting of being and its various disclosures through the course of history would make any sense if he agreed with Husserl on the transparent accessibility of object to an intentional act. In any case, the thing in itself that exceeds direct contact, and not just for humans, is what OOO calls the real. Yeah. So the idea that Graham here is taking from Heidegger is that there's more depth to reality than whatever we see. So whatever Berlin has, it's more than any of our opinions of it, and our opinions can be diluted, but Berlin is, there's a million different views on Berlin. They're all, because there's millions of people out there, so all of them have a different Berlin, and that is more, the Berlin that has all those properties is bigger than anyone's mind and is separate from any delusions people have of it. And so this idea that there's a greater depth to the world than we give it credit for just in our heads, it's like, I think that's a fair point on there. I've always liked that point that they've made here. Berlin takes your breath away. Yeah. Kadir says, so it is about the objectivity, so the square tower does not exist. So the world that, no. I know you wrote that before I got out my last breath because just how Twitch lag works, but the objectivity is that objects are more complicated. That's actually, it's object-oriented ontology with objects being infinitely, well, not infinitely, but way more complicated than what we see of it. So the square tower in our head, yeah, that's not the real object because the real object has way more properties than we ever perceive with our puny little minds. And that's true. Like, there's more to reality. You could always study like the individual stones of the tower, and there's more information there than we'll ever be able to comprehend. So that's the object-oriented ontology, is that the way things exist, these objects are just, they've got more depth to them. Okay, continuing. In arguing that matter can exist in the form of a sensual object, Orensanz appears to be contesting an explicit message in Tool Being that runs as follows, quote, if U is materialism, then it is the first materialism in history to deny the existence of matter, end quote. Orensanz reads this denial in a maximalist sense, as though it denied the possibility that matter could exist even sensually, though he concedes in a footnote that I, quote, had not developed the concept of sensual object in Tool Being that would occur 3 years later in guerrilla metaphysics, end quote. Owner voice, your mind is small and puny. It is. I actually really liked that point the first time I heard it. It's like, it's true. You can go investigate stuff. Like, if you want to investigate something, you can always go investigate more. Like, if you want to go investigate, like, this fucking pencil, as I always say, you can, like, look at the wood. You can look at the graphite. You can look at the, there's, like, a little printing on the side here. You could find out about all this stuff if you wanted to. There's a lot of, you could go study the metal that's part of it, study the rubber. Like, if you want to spend your whole fucking life, you could look at the germs on the surface of that thing with a microscope. You could continuously look at the one object for an indefinite amount of time, depending on how much effort you put into it. Anyway. Okay, but in case I did mean to deny even sensual existence to matter, he lays out a diligent preemptive proof of how, on my own terms, matter should at least be permitted to exist in the sensual realm. After all, guerrilla metaphysics already permits the existence of centaurs as sensual objects. Given this, Orensanz is easily able to show that matter ought to be treated at least as liberally as the mythical horse humans of ancient Greek lore. In so doing, he refers to a similar argument made for the existence of Eli Hirsch's in-cars, defined as cars positioned entirely inside garages, by Daniel Z. Corman, who proposes to demonstrate that such in-cars are every bit as real as islands. Yeah, I mean, once you start allowing yourself to just like break up the world as like fusion and fission, and it's called sometimes, like whatever you want, like certain groupings of the world or objects, yeah, it gets very willy-nilly. As concerns the permissibility for of matter existing as a sensual object, Orensanz is assaulting an open door, though this may be my own fault due to lack of clarity or foresight in the aforementioned passage from Tool Being against materialism. Centaurs in cars with objects. Yeah, something like that. I mean, these are just, you can put things together and they exist. Like, so, centaur is like, the idea of a human and idea of a horse put together, and the in-car is the cars in garages is its own object. I don't know. That I don't know a whole lot about. But yeah, but the idea that you can just like make up objects and then they exist in some real way, yeah, that is a position. I mean, it's an idealistic one. You have an idea and it's real. But like, we're dealing with an idealism here. What about an object within an object? Sure. You could do that probably. I mean, everything is objects here. So if you have an object and you put an object in the object, dog, I got an object for your object, put your object in your object. Yeah, like that's more objects. It's all good. On any occasion where I may have said, quote, matter does not exist, end quote, or anything along those lines, it would have been meant solely to deny the existence of matter as something real. Oh, hell yeah, there you go. In object-oriented ontology's sensual realm, anything goes. Not only centaurs and in-cars circulate freely, but so do out-cars, non-centaurian centaurs, square circles, cartoon characters, and all monsters and demons that one can imagine. The sensual is a kind of Meinongian nature preserve where nothing can be eliminated. Yeah, so if the real world is full of all objects, but your mind can make up whatever the fuck it wants, okay? And you can experience whatever the fuck it wants, I guess, here. I've not heard this position before, but, like, you can see how this might be the case, where you imagine a centaur that could be in the world, but, like, the sense, like, of your imagining that gives you the imagination to put a centaur together, that is free for you, completely free. Okay. Harman continues, yet it is also purely harmless preserve since it does not entail that any of these objects exist independently of thought. We can imagine complaints from the likes of Willard Van Orman Quine that this sensual realm is aesthetically sloppy. Quote, this slum of possibles is a breeding ground for disorderly elements. Take, for instance, the possible fat man in that doorway, and again the possible bald man in that doorway. Are they the same possible man or two possible men? End quote. Yet the objections are irrelevant here since we are not talking about possible sensual objects, but fully actual ones whose number is heavily restricted by the fact that they exist only while someone or something is thinking of them. The sensual object centaur only exists for the one who actually confronts this object right now. Once this person changes their focus of mental attention, he falls asleep or dies, the sensual centaur vanishes from the universe. Yeah, so your idea, guess what? That's an object and it exists. What it is. You have an idea, it's there. Done. It's a very flat ontology. Everything's like, okay, you thought of something cool, that's an object. Which is also a problem. Because you can sort of, that does cause problems at times, how flat this is, everything being an object, but still. Okay. And true enough, Orensanz is right that just as we can think of a centaur, a fat man in the doorway, or a possible bald man in the doorway, we can also think of matter. Thus, I have no objection to the sensual existence of matter, not because it is matter, but because it is anything at all. For a bot, it made sense, but for humans, not. Yeah. I mean, yes. I don't think this philosophy is going to work in the end, but I kind of like it as being out there. You know, I feel like they're at least trying to do something here. And there is, I've read other stuff. There is a tradition that this can draw from. It's actually I think it's an old Arabic philosophy from where God has to intervene in all causal acts. So Harman gives an example of like lighting a match. You did not light the match. You did not do anything. God lit the match. So in some sense, from God's eye view, everything's the same to God. God doesn't care. Like, it's all the same to God. You lit a match and caused a fire. Well, no, God made the fire. And so it's a very flat ontology, but from a God's eye view, this actually makes a lot of sense. So there's from like a Islamic philosophy, there is a tradition here where you can look at this as like, okay, if I'm going to really abstract away from everything, from God's eye view, God treats all God's creations kind of equally. And that's kind of where this is coming out of. So, yeah, so maybe it doesn't make sense for humans, but from like a weird abstract perspective, it does. Okay, continuing. The sensual realm is an ontological safe space where pretty much anything is welcome as long as we relate ourselves to it. The question is whether matter is also real, that is, whether it exists even when no one is positing its existence. While I freely admit that it could exist, I also deny that it does. Yeah, so whatever you think abstract matter is, while you're thinking of it, that exists as your idea, but that doesn't make it in the universe, because again, the only things countenanced are objects. Like, you can again think God's eye view, and from God's eye view, it's all the same to God. There is no abstract matter. Why would there be an abstract matter? There'd just be whatever God created, the match, the fire, whatever it is. Okay, continuing. But before moving on to Orensanz's discussion of the real, I would like to address one recurrent misunderstanding of the real and sensual in U. According to this misreading, the sensual realm consists of all manner of different objects, but then only some of these objects turn out to be real. For instance, if I am in a room which my pet dog is present while I am also imagining a battle of centaurs, then the dog is real, but the centaurs merely sensual. Even as careful a reader as Quentin Meillassoux makes this mistake in connection with qualities rather than objects in his preface to the French translation of my book, Dante's Broken Hammer. Here, Meillassoux misconstrues the standpoint of U as one that is closer to Wilfrid Sellars' distinction between the manifest and scientific images, all of which are images, but only some of which adhere tightly enough to reality. For U, by contrast, there is a radical incommensurability between any image, which can only be sensual in our terms, and the real it aspires to denote. I don't know if Graham can get away with this. You know, why calling something sensual just because it's in your head makes it so special? Because the in your head really doesn't matter either. They're all objects. Where they exist is sort of arbitrary. So I'm not entirely sure I buy this line from Harman here, because I can't separate out the merely sensual objects by saying they're mental. Because I don't know what mental means in this case. Because that's just another object. So I'm not sure I buy that. Okay. But maybe Harman will continue and explain more. Since this point touches on a crucial aspect of my rejection of the existence of matter is worth a bit more of our time. Let's use the term intellectual intuition to refer to the mechanism by which some philosophers hold that reality can be made directly present to the mind via certain mental acts, and something wholly forbidden by Heidegger and Jacques Derrida under the title of metaphysics of presence. Some philosophies, known collectively as direct realism, go even further and hold that pretty much any experience gives us at least some degree of access to the real. But for most advocates of direct access, there are privileged sorts of mental acts that do this with a special adequacy. In Husserl's case, we are meant to follow the path of eidetic reduction and categorical intuition to gain insight into the essence of a thing. For Meillassoux, it is mathematics that enables us to view the primary qualities of things directly. In both cases and in all other such cases of intellectual intuition, an overlap positive between the thing and the mind that knows it. We need only recall Husserl's denial that there is any ontological difference between Berlin itself and the Berlin I intend, despite the fact that real buildings and schools of poetry can exist in Berlin, but not in my mind. Precisely here is where the concept of matter is usually invoked, as a guarantor of the identity of the two Berlins. The idea, in short, is that Berlin can be known directly because one and the same form is contained in the Berlin of the world and the Berlin of my knowledge. The difference between them is that the real Berlin exists in matter, while the Berlin of knowledge does not. But given that formless matter has never been seen or even indirectly detected, its existence can only be justified as a fictional prop for the groundless wish that forms might be moved from the world to the mind without translation or energy loss. I would certainly concede that an imaginary table does not hurt my foot in the night, though a real one often hurts me badly. I simply deny that the difference between them consists in the supposed material existence of the real table. Instead, there is a difference in form between the table that hurts and the one that does not, a difference usually overlooked because we falsely imagine that the presumed visual congruity between the two is enough to establish an identity of form. A similar assumption haunts Kant's inadequate view of the difference between real and imaginary coins. Namely, he holds that all the qualities of the two coins are the same except that the real ones have being, which he then interprets as not a real predicate, so that being has to become a matter of position with respect to us. What Kant fails to see is that the real and imaginary coins do not have the same qualities to begin with, and this prevents him further from addressing the ontological proof for the existence of God in the proper way. But that is a topic for another time. We now return to Orensanz's argument that matter is also a real object. Yeah, so again, I take the point. This is my quarter, like I was showing you. This is my quarter, my philosophical prop. So, like, you guys don't know if this is a real quarter. Maybe this is just an imaginary quarter. I'm just a fake quarter I'm showing you. I mean, that's the point. Now, is the idea in your head of that coin and the actual coin I have just a matter of mine having material existence and the one in your head that you just saw just in your head? Well, Harman is saying that's not it. Saying matter doesn't actually tell you anything about the coin. Like, there's something else to it. So I can see the point here. It's like, well, whatever you're saying matter is, that's not actually a substantive difference. It's not telling you anything about it. Viper says, this whole thing seems very philosophy is just a byproduct of the misunderstanding of language. Yes, we're doing French philosophy at the moment. French-inspired philosophy. So this is the very potentially wishy-washy of the wishy-washiest of philosophies. That is exactly right. We may be in the wishy-washy world right now. But that is also part of philosophy. It's, this happens. You hate it? Yep. You hate it? Okay. Orensanz begins by citing a passage from the 2007 Speculative Realism Workshop in which I appear to argue for the reality of hobbits, after Ray Brassier presses me on the question of whether hobbits are just as real as quarks. My misleading response at the time was that I am a Latourian on this point, that is to say, given that hobbits as literary concepts can have effects on other entities, and given further that despite their fictionality, hobbits cannot conceivably fit just anywhere, such as in the novels of Proust, they must be granted a certain reality. Anyone familiar with my critical appreciation of Latour in Prince of Networks and elsewhere will immediately recognize that I do not hold that for something to have an effect on the world qualifies it as a real object. That is Latour's own position, but definitely not mine. Yeah. Orensanz himself clarifies this by helpfully citing a later email in which I specify that a hobbit should instead be interpreted as a sensual object with real qualities, which is precisely how I read Husserl's intentional object. For All sensual objects have real qualities, since otherwise they would consist of nothing but swirling accidental features. As a result, 1. Intentional objects would be nothing more than a series of adumbrations, and 2. All intentional objects would be the same. Yeah, so it's like saying, okay, your thoughts matter. Why do your thoughts matter? Because they have actual effects on you. If they didn't have actual effects, then it would all just be imagination, but it would all be the same because you couldn't even make a distinction about within your imagination. But because you can imagine different things and those imaginings might matter to you in different ways, they have real properties, even though the imagined things are not themselves real. This is not a crazy thought. It should also be noted that sensual objects are sometimes able to turn into real ones in ways that neither I nor anyone else connected with OO has written much about, but this is not the place to develop that notion. Herdur, is a map the world? Yeah, but the maps definitely do affect how we travel the world. So it's like, yeah, the map is not the world, but like it also, maps are very political objects where you draw lines and what parts of the map belong to who. So it's like, yeah, the map is not the world, but the way the lines are drawn on that piece of paper will get you killed also. Or can get you killed. Okay, in any case, Orensanz is right that I have to treat matter as liberally as I treat hobbits. Even though I do not accept the existence of something called matter, I must at least concede that matter qua sensual object has real qualities. The concept matter does not exist after all, and it does lead people to behave and react in specific ways while discussing it, though from the OO standpoint, it is nothing but a fiction. Of course, Orensanz notes that at least some scientific materialists are equally happy to call matter a fiction. He points in particular to Mario Bunge, who, and more recently Gustavo Romero. Gustavo Romero. What these authors share in common is the notion that matter is merely a concept, while what really exists are individual material beings. Orensanz seems to be in agreement on this score. OO would certainly agree with all of them that a concept is not quite a real object in the strict sense, and would further agree that individual beings are all that exist, though OO sees no reason to call these individuals material. This does not mean that I find the remainder of their argument satisfying. After all, if one believes in a plethora of something called material beings, it seems clear that one is committed to the existence of something like matter in a way that OO is not, even if that matter is found nowhere else than in fully formed individuals. Yeah, so again, this locational talk right here concerns me a little bit. It's like, I get that Harman just is like, look, we have experiences and that's what we do. And like, that's the sensual world and that's part of our experience. But then he's like, all right, but the ones that are just part of our experience, again, don't have this sort of like, they don't exist in the world in the ways objects do. They're mental objects sort of dependent on us. Again, this dependency worries me because that's one thing that doesn't get countenanced in object-oriented ontology because everything's an object. This further dependence makes me worried. Okay. Harman continues. But the claim that only individual material beings exist leads Orensanz to some additional mereological claims with which I largely disagree and which may be of interest to readers. In particular, he borrows from Daniel Corman the idea of a distinguished plural, which Orensanz will use to describe his own conception of matter no less than Bunge and Romero's. If we consider an assortment of numerous random things, most of us will not be inclined to treat that assortment as a single individual, even though it is grammatically singular. You think I should say oh like a mocking applause, like oh. Yeah, I kind of like the ooh though, because it's just silly. But like, yeah, I get what you mean. I could do this another way, be like the oh. Okay, this is a clear and illuminating case of a disguised plural. Corman also presents a more intriguing case, the Supreme Court. Here again we have an example that is grammatically singular, but is the famed court really an individual being? Corman and Orensanz himself say that it is not. The reason, as stated by Orensanz, is that, quote, it's generally considered that the relation of parthood is transitive. Oh, whoa, yeah. In layman's terms, if the Supreme Court is a single entity composed of 9 justices, then the parts of the justices should also be parts of the court. But this would lead to an apparently ridiculous result, as seen in the following rhetorical question from Corman. Quote, is the Supreme Court a single fleshy object with 9 tongues and 18 elbows? End quote. Always committed to a spirit of fair play, Orensanz cites our aforementioned correspondence of 2022, in which I argued that parthood is not transitive. The source to which I appealed was Manuel Delande's discussion of emergence, in particular his idiosyncratic but effective use of the term redundant causation. In Delande's usage, redundant causation refers to the fact that an object can lose many of its components while still remaining the same object, as when a tire loses a multitude of atoms or Los Angeles bids farewell each year to the many residents who die or move away. The same insight was anticipated by Aristotle in the Metaphysics when he said that a thing is only made of its most proximate pieces. We might plausibly refer to semen as a potential human, but to refer to wheat as a potential human would be skipping too far down the line. Yeah, see, this is one of those weird things. We have to start getting some weird causation theory to make up for how things interact now. Now, maybe this is legit, but like this is what you start having to do. You get farther and farther away from normal discussion of how causation works, and you have to do something even that like is noted here to be idiosyncratic discussion called redundant causation, which I don't know what this is. So it's like, does this actually fix the problem or is it worse? I don't know, but this is what happens when you start getting away from your typical metaphysics and you have to start doing things that, you know, who knows? Maybe this is a great idea, but I have no idea if it is at this point. Orensanz then plausibly links my view and Delande's with Bunge's idea of levels of composition. For instance, animals have brains as parts, but since it is entire animals rather than brains that engage in social relations, we can easily dismiss the transitive assumption that brains, as parts of animals, would also be directly involved in social relations. But here Orensanz worries that such means of avoiding the transitivity of parthood might lead to emergent entities that are somehow disembodied. For instance, in light of the multiple structural layers separating an entire cell from its constituent atoms, we might be led to the dangerous conclusion that cells have no atoms. Here, however, I think Orensanz is equivocating between multiple senses of have. Los Angeles without any people would in some sense not be Los Angeles anymore, but merely the ghostly remnants of a city. It does not follow, however, that the need for a city to have people means that individual humans need to have direct causal impact on the city as a whole without intervening emergent layers. In the case of the Supreme Court, it should be equally clear why the court is not a fleshly entity consisting of 9 tongues and 18 elbows. If one or more of the justices of the court were to lose their tongues or one or both arms in some grotesque, tragic accident, this would inspire much public sympathy, but would surely not raise doubts as to whether the thereby disabled justices were still members of the court. To summarize, when we consider a human being qua judge, arms and tongues take on the aspect of mere accidents. The difference between the essential and the accidental takes on further importance when Orensanz plays with another variant of the supposed paradox. Quote, if parthood isn't transitive, it follows that your fingers are not part of your body. So you don't have fingers. End quote. But this is a non sequitur akin to saying that if people are not the proximate element of Los Angeles, then Los Angeles has no people. Or better in Aristotle's terms, if wheat is not a potential human, then humans do not consume wheat. Concluding remarks. Although Orensanz continues to raise interesting ideas until the final page of the article, our main topic effectively ends on page 14, for it is there that Orensanz outlines 5 possible ways of dealing with the problems covered so far. The two interest The two of interest to us here are my own rejection of the transitivity of parthood, number 3 on the list, and Orensanz's preferred solution, number 5, of the disguised plural. He admits that he faces an uphill battle in his future systematic defense of this position, though in denying that society exists as anything more than an assortment of individuals, he can count on the assistance of the late Bruno Latour, who was endlessly horrified by Emile Durkheim's unified society with a capital S. But one need not accept Durkheim's view to support the idea that societies are formed of emergent layers of structure rather than simply of piecemeal individual humans. If I have a worry about Orensanz's own developing social theory, it is a concern that his final picture of society will contain far more elbows and tongues than necessary, to say nothing of atoms. And that's it. Hooray! Okay, so for the first review of the new year, feel free to spam some emotes in chat. If you're new here, if you're an old hand at this, keep in mind, this is the emote review. Feel free to throw some of the emotes. If you don't see them in your chat, they're below here on screen, and they're better TTV, so you just got to install the extension so they're available to everyone. If you thought this was fun, give you some ideas, give it a brain dance. You can give it multiple brain dances if you want. Nog Scream for existential or artistic drama. Oh, note, spelling and capitalization do matter here. DeBarshall gave it a yay and brain dance. Thank you. Scream for existential or artistic drama. We weren't talking too much art here, but maybe you think it's existential. I don't know. Nagoro or Borse for deeper ancient ideas. Nog Knife for slicing and dicing arguments. Nog Navel, navel gazing only for academics. Nog Turd, all style, no substance, still poop underneath. And Nog Grapes for big claims that shrivel up. You can also use the global vote yay and nay, vote nay of Twitch, and my vote meh. Note that everything in the green I'm calculating an overall score. Everything in the green will make it go up. Everything in the red will make it go down. And the vote makes everything go towards the middle. The Watcher of Games did a yay. Vipers gave it a navel gazing, a poop, and a nay. Caldeo gave it a brain dance. Thank you for your reviews. Yeah, I mean, this sort of radical metaphysics and ontology is not going to be for everyone. So you're going to get people, I guess, like Vipers who said, look, this is nuts. It is a little nuts. It's such a flat ontology. Everything's an object. You're saying there's no matter out there. That's insane. Okay? He has his arguments. You might not like the arguments, and that's why I'm not surprised it got a poop here. Because it looks fancy, but what do you mean there's no matter? I get it. Unreal says, brain dance knife. Not sure he actually came together to make a convincing point. So, meh and nay. Fair. Entirely fair, because this is a response paper, and we didn't read the original criticism of him, so it's hard to say. Now, what he said kind of made sense, but again, did it? We don't know. And I was saying I'm worried. I had my worries. I didn't say. It wasn't like I didn't have my worries on this. Why are there so many horrible people in the movement? The object-oriented ontology movement? I don't know if they are. I don't even know these people. This is not my area. DeMar says I have many questions, but first, what does it have to do with the programming, object-oriented programming? It doesn't. It has nothing to do with that. I think the history is that they came up with this and they had no idea that there was object-oriented programming. Yeah. Oh, the accelerationists? Oh, yeah. Because this is flaky French philosophy in some sense. It's kind of hip. And so I think the accelerationists jump on the hip philosophy. I think that's really it, because it's a little flaky. It's easily manipulable. And so anything that's easily manipulable is just going to get co-opted by dickheads. But yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you are an adherent to object-oriented ontology and you're serious about the metaphysics, you're going to admit the strengths and the weaknesses of that theory, of that metaphysics. It has nothing to do with accelerationism on the surface. So you might not be an accelerationist, but it's got whatever benefits you get, it also has these weaknesses. Unreal says both the ooze and the accelerations pull from Deleuze, so that from the end up with some overlap. I see. So there's a historical thing there too. Interesting. Yeah, you're just going to get some of that stuff as it goes. So what do I say for this? I don't even know. Yeah, I'm kind of in the meh world too. Like, I've heard object-oriented ontology before. I hadn't heard this object-oriented stuff about matter. It kind of makes sense what Harman was saying. So I'm going to give it a... Viper says, I'm easily manipulated, so I got co-opted by dickheads, hence the mod badge. I mean, you did get modded with saying no one in their right mind would mod me, and then I modded you. So, you know, for talking about matter in such an unusual way, they're going to get a brain dance. They're also getting a vote mad because, well, you know, there's nothing crazy here. It is kind of, we're getting a meh. It's a brain dance and a meh. There's nothing much to it. Now, I appreciate Brian's giving this a knife also. Like, you know, Harman did attempt to, you know, put some arguments together, but in the end, I'm not entirely sure they worked. So it'd be like, if I give it a knife, I might have to also give it a turd. And it's like, I don't know if it deserves, like, all of these ratings. But then again, it's not that bad either. Neil says, there are lefty accelerations, Fisher, Shernsek, another guy, forgetting what you can disagree with, but they aren't prima facie awful. Okay. I generally don't want to hear any accelerationism because it always feels like this is what your vision of the future is, and like everyone alive nowadays doesn't really matter compared to like where you think we're going, and I don't want to hear that shit. Like, people are dying today. We have to save the people dying today and try to make the future less shitty. But like, if you're just looking at the future, like, you're missing out on the suffering now. And I never liked that. So I don't know enough about accelerationism, but like, it just always feels like it's crappy tech bros trying to justify their shitty behavior. So, yeah.